From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It all began, as so many stories do, with a journalistic breakthrough. 2 years ago, the political editor of the Sunday Times, Caroline Wheeler, was sat at her desk chasing a lead when she stumbled upon an unbelievable story. She told us about it at the time.
We'd had a tip that there had been some kind of infiltration of Parliament by a hostile state. We didn't know which country it was. We didn't know what type of infiltration it had been. So we were kind of scraping around in a sort of exhaustive bowl of potentials, really. Fairly quickly, after having made one, and it was one lucky phone call, I had this amazing sort of breakthrough where one of my sources said to me, well, of course you should speak to this individual. That individual was Chris Cash.
It was the start of an astonishing story.
It's the allegation shaking Westminster, a Chinese spy working in the heart of Whitehall, with access to MPs and senior officials at the levers of power.
According to reports, 28-year-old Chris Cash was arrested for spying for China.
We are hearing that UK prosecutors have just authorised charges against 2 men who are alleged to have breached the Official Secrets Act on behalf of China.
Chris Cash and Christopher Berry, the 2 men accused of spying on behalf of China, were finally due to face trial this month. But days before it was due to begin, the case spectacularly fell apart.
The collapse of a huge spy case involving 2 British men accused of spying for China has now led to a blame game between the Labour government and the Tory one that came before.
It snowballed into the biggest political row in the country, with the government blaming their Conservative predecessors.
The case did not proceed because the policy of the past government did not meet the test that was necessary. That is the long and the short of it.
And the Tories laying the blame squarely on the PM.
Today we learn that Labour deliberately collapsed the trial of 2 men accused of spying on MPs for China because the Prime Minister wants to suck up to Beijing. This is squalid.
The Prime Minister has now been forced to publish the evidence that's being blamed for the case collapsing. And yet, the questions won't go away. Did the government give China a free pass in order to secure better trade? And who's to blame for this national security catastrophe? The story today. The inside story of the China spy case collapse and the political row that won't go away.
I'm Caroline Wheeler and I'm the political editor of the Sunday Times. And I broke the original story about the arrest of Chris Cash and Christopher Berry, the 2 individuals that were arrested on suspicion of spying for China.
Caroline, Westminster is currently in the grip of an enormous row about China. And at the heart of it all is a story that you actually broke 2 years ago when you had a tip-off about an alleged spy in Parliament. We did a whole episode on that, and if you want to go back and listen to it, and it is an extraordinary story, I would highly recommend it. We'll put a link in the description of this podcast. But just very quickly, remind us of what happened.
It was over the summer months and we'd received just a very, very vague tip. But I just got really lucky with one phone call that I made when I spoke to a particular MP who had some knowledge of what was going on. And basically, because of who that MP was and where their interests lay, I basically worked out it was China and started digging from there, basically. And I remember looking for Chris Cash on Twitter, and it was very strange because his Twitter account had disappeared, completely disappeared. And I had his telephone number, which somebody had helpfully given me, and the number didn't go through. And I remember speaking to my friend and saying, it's really weird, this guy's completely disappeared. And then I'd heard that Chris Cash had recently got a new job. And I called the boss of that organisation and said, I'm trying to get hold of Chris Cash, can you help me? And they turned around and said, yeah, it's really weird. We offered him this job and then we've never heard from him again. And that was the moment, I think, when alarm bells really went off, that this was potentially the person that had been apprehended in relation to whatever this story was.
Who was Chris Cash? What was his role in Parliament and what was he accused of doing?
So Chris Cash was a parliamentary researcher. He worked for an organisation called the China Research Group. There are a number of these kind of organisations in Parliament which take a kind of an express interest in one particular area of foreign policy or domestic policy. But on this occasion, it was obviously China. And we obviously don't know the full details of what he was accused of doing, other than that he was charged under the Official Secrets Act for obtaining, collecting, recording, publishing or communicating notes, documents or information which might be or intended to be directly or indirectly useful to an enemy. But we've never actually seen the full details of what he's accused of doing. Now, what we do know that came out in the pre-trial hearing was that there were 34 reports of information that was allegedly passed to the Chinese, 10 of which were deemed to have had a national security nexus.
Wow.
And it's recently been reported by the Guardian newspaper that Chris Cash and Chris Berry, who was also accused of the same things, and Christopher Berry was another researcher, he was an academic from Oxford, was that they were passing information to an individual called Cai Qi, who was one of the most powerful members of the Politburo for the Communist Party in China. He was, in fact, the fifth most senior ranking official in that party. So he was the de facto chief of staff to President Xi. Now, of course, we have to say that both Chris Cash and Christopher Berry deny all charges, and we've no way of independently verifying that this information was passed to this individual. But we do know from the pre-trial hearing that it was claimed that information was passed to the CCP.
And very high up.
And very high
in
up.
the CCP, in the
Yeah.
Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
So, Caroline, we now have two men who have access to government, who are working on a Chinese research group, who have access to ministers, access to information that the general public might not, who are being accused of reporting back to China, of sending some of this information, some of it highly sensitive national security questions, to China. What happens?
So the story sort of began back in March 2023 when they were arrested. And it was a big story at the time. There were pictures of Chris Cash plastered all over the front page of the Times. And then, of course, what happens is the story kind of goes quiet until such a time as it comes to trial. So even over the summer months, I was being kind of kept abreast of what was going on. It was still being said to me that the security services believed that this was a very strong case, that it was, as they described, a slam dunk, and that's not in terms of the fact that they thought they would get a guilty verdict, but that they thought that they had sufficient evidence to prosecute this case. And then out of nowhere, on the 15th of September, dropped this incredible admission that the case and the charges were being dropped against the defendants. And the claim was made at the time was that there was an evidential problem with it, which was a surprise to many of us, because actually reading some of the information which has come out subsequently from the Director of Public Prosecution, Stephen Parkinson, he has maintained that when they were charged back in 2024, there was sufficient evidence to prosecute this case. But yet when it came to September 2025, he admitted that there no longer was the sufficient evidence to proceed with the case, indicating very heavily that something had changed in that intervening period.
So the case collapses because of something that has changed. Do we know what that might be?
If you actually look at the most substantive admission by Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions, he says very clearly in a letter that, in essence, the case collapsed because evidence that they had requested, which he said they had requested of the government over many months, was not forthcoming. And they say that that was the reason that they, and it was the CPS that made the decision to collapse the case, decided to drop the charges.
And that really triggered this whole row over who's to blame. The CPS says for the trial to go ahead, the government would have had to provide evidence that stated formally that China was a threat to national security, and the government didn't do that. The government, in turn, are blaming the Tories because their policy on China was in place at the time, and there are also serious questions about the CPS's role in the case collapsing. Caroline, one man who lots of fingers are pointing at in all of this is Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor. Just tell us about him.
So Jonathan Powell is the National Security Advisor, which means that he should oversee all decisions about national security that affect the United Kingdom. Myself and Gabriel Pogrund at the Sunday Times reported that the case had collapsed just days after there had been a top secret meeting of civil servants, which was chaired by Jonathan Powell, which had included Oliver Robbins, the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, and also Matthew Collins had also been there. And
his deputy.
Which is his deputy. And they had discussed the parameters of the case and also this very particular document, the National Security Strategy, which had been published this year, and basically talked about how the framing of the evidence that they were going to give in this case would have to be consistent with what this document had said, which stopped, as I say, very short of accusing China of being a threat.
So basically deciding that the evidence they gave shouldn't say that China is a threat.
Exactly. So that story went viral. It got picked up virtually everywhere and precipitated this kind of blame game, or this kind of circular firing squad, as I see it, between the government and the CPS over whose fault it was. But he has become very much the focus of some of the ire around this case because, he's very, very experienced in this particular role that he does.
And he has actually been to China quite a lot since taking office.
He went to China in a meeting over the summer to meet his counterpart. This is ahead of what we are expecting to be a visit by the Prime Minister probably early in the new year, when presumably that visit will include lots of announcements about, other trading agreements that we've come up with them.
In the meantime, the case collapses. Westminster is up in arms, and it does lead to a huge political row in Parliament earlier this week. Just remind us of what happened.
Dan Jarvis, the Security Minister, comes forward proactively with a statement about this.
The government remains extremely disappointed by the outcome of the Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry case.
And of course, it very quickly became a whole series of questions about the collapse of the case and what had happened. And I think Dan Jarvis went further than any minister has been before, really refuting lots of what we have written, what other journalists have written, and effectively saying Jonathan Powell had no nexus in this decision for the case to be dropped. Basically said there was not a shred of evidence, which...
And no meeting, which you had
and
you
no
had reported
meeting,
on.
Which is an astonishing claim. I mean, as you will know, Manveen, as a journalist, we don't report these things unless we literally have people in the room.
And Caroline, as part of his defence, Dan Jarvis, in order to point out how little he thought Jonathan Powell had to do with the decision, ended up naming Matthew Collins. We've mentioned him a couple of times. He's Jonathan Powell's deputy. For many people beyond Westminster, he was a name nobody had heard of before. Just remind us who he is and what Dan Jarvis says his role was.
So as you so rightly say, he's Jonathan Powell's deputy. He is also, and I'm going to get this wrong because it's a mouthful, but it's like the Cabinet Office National Security Secretariat. So he chairs that very sort of jargonistic body, which basically has a function in terms of determining issues of national security alongside Jonathan Powell. He was the one that was basically tasked with presenting evidence on behalf of the government. So in essence, he provided 3 witness statements to government, setting out the government's position in terms of their view of this particular case and how they view China. And basically what Dan Jarvis said was that it was nothing to do with anybody else. Everything that had happened had been unilaterally decided by Matthew Collins. So the entire government's position had been taken by him in absence of anybody else.
That's basically what this case now comes down to. It's whether there was enough evidence that China is a threat, and that's why the case collapses. And that evidence, it seems, would have come from this witness. And this witness is now named as Matthew Collins. And the question for Westminster really is, did he make that decision independently? Was there this meeting that would have told him what to think, how to interpret their position? And that's still a very, very, very live debate. In the meantime, there's clearly a lot of anger from across the House and from civil servants about Matthew Collins being suddenly in the frame for all of this. We've had Tom Tugendhat, a very senior Tory, saying he shouldn't be thrown under the bus for this. And a very weird moment at Cabinet. Tell us about that.
Once again in Cabinet, and it's interesting because the government doesn't always release kind of very detailed Cabinet briefings about what was talked about. It only really happens when it's sort of on the ropes over something or other. And in this particular case, the Prime Minister talked about Matthew Collins as being a sort of very important and valued member of the Cabinet Office and of the government's team, really trying to defend the claim that basically the government was making it all his fault. But look, I mean, I think what's really important here is that there are actually questions now for both sides. Because on the one hand, you know, the government is saying very, very clearly this was all about what Matthew Collins said in his evidence. They are saying that they were hamstrung by the last government. But on the other side, you know, there are still serious questions about the CPS, of the legal brains that I've been speaking to in and around Parliament. What they are saying is all that needs to be demonstrated is that in this particular case, it represented a threat to national security, which clearly, by the very nature of the offences, i.e. spying on MPs, it would seem demonstrably true that it could meet that threshold.
Just talk us through this, because it does seem like a lot of this comes down to the need to prove that China was a threat, and that comes from the Official Secrets Act. Is that even the act they should be using?
They could have chosen a different offence, that's true, but they chose to prosecute this case under the Official Secrets Act, which basically meant that they had to demonstrate that the information that was allegedly passed to the Chinese was of a nature that was likely to compromise national security. I've been speaking to people about what that sort of information might have been, and one of the suggestions was that, for example, Chris Cash may have had access to the unredacted version of the China report by the Intelligence and Security Committee, which talked about the threat that China posed. And there was an annex to that which wasn't published, which, as I understand it, included details, for example, of the number of intelligence officers that worked for the Chinese security organisations vis-a-vis the number that worked for both the CIA and for MI5 and MI6, which would be potentially useful to them because it would give them a sense of scale of how big our security services are, for example. I also understand from speaking to some of the other witnesses in the case that what had allegedly got into the hands of the Chinese was as part of a delegation to Taiwan, not only the hotel that delegation was staying in, but even the floor of the hotel they were staying in, and potentially even the number of the rooms that they were staying in.
In the meantime, the row just seems to be escalating across Westminster. I mean, just explain how much of a problem it's become for the government and also potentially for the Tories. There is a lot of sort of mudslinging on both sides.
At the heart of this story is really whether a decision was taken on this particular case, because it was an inconvenience to the government, because it conflicted with its desires, aims, goals in terms of the trading relationship that it wants to have with China. Now, we know that the government is kind of riding three horses at the moment. It sees economic growth as its number one aim, and it is trying desperately to repair relationships with the EU, maintain and develop relationships with the United States, but also to develop its relationships with China. And so the big question facing the government is, has it jeopardised national security because it has prioritised the UK's economic interests? And one of the things that keeps coming up in the context of this is the application by the Chinese for a new mega embassy in London on the Royal Mint site. It would be the biggest embassy that China has got anywhere in Western Europe. But also there have been concerns raised about the fact that beneath it lie very sensitive cabling, which linked to for example, to the London Stock Exchange. So suggestions that it could make our sort of financial institutions more vulnerable to Chinese hacking.
You've got this sense that the government is trying to make life as easy as possible for the Chinese government in order to get better trade, to get a better relationship going. That's not going down very well in Westminster, especially with this case collapsing and the very real risks of that relationship being highlighted. So much of this row is about who exactly is to blame. I mean, if heads do roll, whose do you think they'll be?
My fear is that people will try to make Dan Jarvis or Matthew Collins the scapegoat in this. But, I think the pressure does, ratchet up now. It ratchets up on what Jonathan Powell knew. But it's actually pressure on the Prime Minister himself. People are saying it would be totally inconceivable that a decision of this magnitude did not cross the Prime Minister's desk.
After this podcast was recorded, late last night, the government released the witness statements from Matthew Collins that were presented to the Crown Prosecution Service. The first statement, from 2023, stated that China was carrying out large-scale espionage activities in the UK. The Deputy National Security Advisor had then submitted 2 further witness statements in February and August of this year under the new Labour government. In them, he described China as the biggest state-based threat to the UK's economic security and accused Chinese espionage operations of threatening the UK's economic prosperity, resilience and the integrity of our democratic institutions. But he also added that it's important to emphasise that the government is committed to pursuing a positive economic relationship with China. In response to the publication of those statements, Chris Cash issued one of his own, saying he'd been placed in an impossible position. The statements that have been made public are completely devoid of the context that would have been given at trial, and again reiterating his belief that he was completely innocent.
Caroline, in all of this, a lot of the government trying to defend itself has relied on effectively undermining the reporting around the case, and a lot of that has come directly from you. How has that felt?
I think the thing that worries me more than anything else is that it's really important that we have a trusting relationship with governments, that we are able to put information to governments and get a response that we think is credible. I mean, just to explain to listeners, we don't publish things unless we have at least 2 sources on them. Often that can mean that it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to run a story. So it's very alarming, I think, when you get to a situation where effectively the government is calling you out and calling out your reporting and effectively accusing you of lying. We're going to end up in a situation where that relationship is going to break down, and that's not going to be good for them. It's not going to be good for us. And it's not going to be good for the public interest either, who have an absolute right to get to the bottom of what's happened in this case, because, as we've been discussing, the ramifications of this are far too serious. As the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, has said, it basically hands China a sort of open invitation to spy on MPs in this country because we're not prosecuting these 2 individuals. So it's an uncomfortable place to be.
That was Caroline Wheeler, political editor of The Sunday Times. You can find all the latest on the China spy case online at thetimes.com, with analysis and updates also running on Times Radio. The producers today were Olivia Case and Micaela Arneson, with help from Alula Hart. The executive producer was Kate Lamble, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.